Elang nerds, welcome to Elang Explained. This video is a part of our core curriculum series where we break down some of the key concepts and pieces of meta-language from units 1 to 4 English language. So get excited for today's episode where we're going to be learning some meta-language and recapping some of our key sociolinguistic concepts. Get excited because today we're going to be talking through the functions of language. Now, when we're thinking about the functions of language, it's really important to remember that in English language, we're using Jacobson's functions of language. There are 5 functions of language. There are 6 functions of language, and you can remember them using the mnemonic MP perk, because of course, MPs get a lot of perks. Those functions include language that is metalinguistic, phatic, poetic, referential, and conative. And in this video, you're going to hear a brief explanation of what each of these functions involves, and then we're going to have a look at a text that includes language that reflects each of these functions to see if you can spot language that is metalinguistic, that is phatic, that is poetic, that is referential, and that is conative. So, when we're thinking about Jacobson's functions, it's important to remember that each of the 6 functions is distinct, that it includes language features that reflect a specific function of the text. So let's start at the beginning of MP perk. Language that has a metalinguistic function aims to clarify the meaning of language itself. So we often see this function when someone is asking a question about how to interpret language. If you've ever said, "What did you mean by that?" and then someone else has explained the language they've used back to you, then you've taken part in a discourse that has a metalinguistic function. Next up is the phatic function. And language that has a phatic function is aiming to reflect the social distance and relationship between participants in a discourse. Very often, it's aiming to reflect a close social distance or functioning to close the social distance between 2 participants who have started off the conversation with a wider social distance. If you've ever said to someone, "Hey, how are you? It's so great to see you," then you've taken part in a discourse that has a phatic function. The poetic function, though, reflects the aesthetic, the beautiful, the playful elements of our language. So when we think about a poetic function, it's important that we're able to justify how the language being used is aesthetic. And this, for the team here at Elang Explained, often means we're going to be talking about a type of patterning that's been used. The next function is emotive. And it's really important not to overthink this function, because language that has an emotive function is reflecting a specific emotion or feeling within the discourse. If you've ever said to someone, "I'm so excited," or "I'm so tired," then you've used language that has an emotive function because you've been in that moment trying to communicate a very specific feeling or emotion that you're having through the language that you're using. Our next function is referential. And referential language states a fact or opinion. It gives information in a conversation. In fact, right now, a lot of the language that I'm using has a referential function because I'm using my language very deliberately to state the definitions of each of these terms. Although, I guess because I'm specifically clarifying the meaning of each of Jacobson's functions, you could also potentially argue that this language has a metalinguistic function too. Last but not least is the conative function. And this is where we're using language very deliberately to give a demand or a request. We're asking our audience or the participants in a discourse to do or not do something. And if you're an Elang student, you will actually be super familiar with language that has a conative function because teachers use this kind of language all the time. When we say things like, "Open up your laptops, grab out your writing books, make sure that you get this task done for homework." All of these examples really clearly reflecting that conative function because they're asking the participants in the discourse or the audience to complete a very specific action. So, after a brief explanation of each of Jacobson's functions, let's see how you go identifying them in a text. This is a text that you probably haven't seen before. It's taken from Zoo News, which is a section on the Melbourne Zoo website where they post often daily updates about the animals, conservation, and different zoo programs. This text is specifically about the arrival of 3 new gorillas at Melbourne Zoo, who've joined the zoo from Taronga. Take a moment, have a read of this text and see if you can identify language in this text that reflects each of the 6 functions. So, how did you go? Now, I've deliberately changed the background so that this color coding is hopefully a little bit easier for you to see. Anything that is green in this text is metalinguistic. The metalinguistic function in this text is best shown through that second sentence. The new girl group or troop were carefully transported from Sydney. Now, you can see a metalinguistic function here in that section, or troop. We've got the coordinating conjunction or and troop there, which is the more specific jargonistic term for a group of gorillas. And you can see across this text, once Melbourne Zoo has stated troop in brackets first, they then use this term to consistently refer to the group of gorillas. But the first time they use it, instead of just saying troop straight away and using this jargon, they've chosen that noun group, which is a much more common noun, something that the audience are going to be much more familiar with, before then clarifying the specific jargonistic term. We've got language that is phatic right at the end. While the introductions are underway, the new gorillas might not be on view straight away. Aiming here to deliberately connect with their audience of people who regularly go to the zoo or who are interested in seeing these new gorillas. And they're using this complex sentence to manage the expectations of the audience, who clearly are people very interested in Melbourne Zoo's new additions to the gorilla troupe. Then we've got some poetic language in the red. With the sentence, I think he's trying to play it cool in front of the new ladies in his life, but we know he's super excited too. And we at Elang Explained think that this is pretty poetic because we've got a clear example of alliteration with ladies in his life, with that repetition of the ul phoneme. But we've also got that figurative language of play it cool. And when we're thinking about this verb phrase, trying to play it cool, it has that figurative aspect, because what Melbourne Zoo is talking about here is the fact that this male gorilla is trying to present a calm and collected front, but he's also very excited. Then we've got some emotive language in the yellow. And this is where we're seeing those emotions of excitement, of awe, of wonder at the behavior of these gorillas, the way that they've settled in, and the way that they've been exploring their new habitat. Purple is for our referential language that's really clearly stating facts about these gorillas. And we've got whole paragraphs dedicated to explaining key facts about each of the new gorillas, as well as talking a little bit about gorilla families. Lastly, we've got that connotative sentence at the very end. Keep coming back for the chance to see them settle in and check the member zone for any updates, with 2 very clear instructions for the audience. To number 1, keep coming back to the zoo to see these gorillas settle in. And number 2, to keep checking the member zone or the zoo news for any updates about these gorillas. So, how'd you go? If you think you've found any other examples than we've spoken about today of any of the 6 functions in this text, make sure to add them to the comments. But that's all we have time for today. Remember to be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.